Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar in our 2021 series entitled Building Student Visual Literacy for a Diverse Image-Saturated World. I'm Rebecca Edwards, and I'll be your host today. So today's webinar focuses on how to read an image. We hope it'll get you started thinking about the basics of visual literacy, if you haven't already. And as the year progresses, we hope that you'll continue to join us for subsequent webinars in this series, where we'll continue to delve deeper into this topic. While our focus today is on images of works of art in the Getty Museum's collection, our goal is for you to be able to apply these same concepts to all different types of images that span well beyond our collection and even beyond art museums. Nevertheless, we also hope to inspire you to incorporate works of art into your teacher practice across subject areas by showing you how easy it is to connect them to curriculum. So why did we design a series of webinars around visual literacy? Well, one reason was that we got a lot of questions and interest expressed in last year's webinar series around this topic and around the use of art as a visual image and how to look at art. So in researching this topic, I found out that there was somebody named John Devis from Eastman Kodak who originally coined the term way back in 1968. You can see here in the slide how he described it as strategies and skills that one needs to make sense of visual images. You can also see a couple of other definitions that have developed over the years about what visual literacy can be. And in fact, you can find theoretical books covering it for hundreds of pages. But essentially, it's about having the skills that you need to use, to read images, to make images, to understand them, use them for communication, and to learn about what others are trying to tell you. Also, to be able to think in terms of images and learn in terms of images. So why do we think that this is useful for teachers? Well, of course, we're an art museum, so we're used to using images all the time as a way to access points of view of people from different times and places, to learn about human creativity, different kinds of self-expression, and a whole lot more. But we'll also point out some special aspects of images for the classroom. One is that they provide multiple ways to access your curriculum, especially with students who maybe their strength isn't reading. It offers a way for them to shine and find areas of strength that might not be reading. It engages students. It's something different to look at images. It uses different kinds of learning styles and different ways of thinking. It also supports critical thinking because to really understand an image, you have to analyze it and you have to think critically about it. The other thing that's nice about it is for certain students who may have disabilities like dyslexia that impact their ability to read, or English language learners, using images in your classroom is a way to connect with those students that's different and more geared to their strengths. So last but not least, and what's really important to us, is that they connect us with other people, the makers and what the makers were trying to tell us. And so it's a way to really start to learn about different people who are different from ourselves, from different times, and to begin to develop empathy and an understanding for other points of view. So I also found an interesting comment in one of the books I was looking at that I thought was interesting and thought about, and I think I agree with it, so I thought I would share it, which is that images allow us to see things directly. If you think about it, if you read a description of something, but you've never seen it, you may paint an image of it in your head, but it's different from actually seeing an image of it. So there's something special about the information that you get from an image. And most of all, and what's really important, is that being able to critically engage with images is a skill, just like any other skill. It's not something that students or anybody automatically know how to do. So teachers have the opportunity to guide students and give them opportunities to practice these skills, just like any other skills, including interpreting, analyzing, and evaluating the images that they're looking at. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to our other speaker today, who is Darcy Beeman Black. She is my colleague at the Getty Museum. She works with us in teacher programs. She's the Associate Education Specialist, and she'll be talking some more about the nitty-gritty of how to read an image.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. And hello, everybody. So now that Rebecca has sort of shared why visual literacy is important and why we think it's important to include in your classroom teaching, I'm going to go over how to read an image. So now that we've talked about how important it is, how do we do it? So we have created this infographic with all of the steps and elements of how to read an image. I do want to say this is not the only one out there. We created this one because we thought it was it made it easy for us to share with you all how to do this. We've broken it down into 3 steps. So the first step is, basically take inventory of the visual elements, look at the image. What does the image contain? You'll see that I have 2 sides here. On the left side of step 1, you can see that I've listed ways you can take inventory. So the 30-second look, looking at an image for about 30 seconds, you can verbally describe it, you can zoom in and out, walk towards it, walk away from it, hold it close, hold it away. You can draw it or you can write about it. And then on the right side, you can see that I have included possible things that would be in an image. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is definitely somewhere a place to get started. So you can find all the figures, all of the formal elements. This would include the elements and principles of art. So things like line, shape, color, proportion. The Getty website has a whole section dedicated to all of these elements. So if you're interested in learning about all of them, you can go there. And we'll go over some of them in our presentation today. There's also things you can find in an image like symbols. So a symbol can be something like a heart, but it can also be something like the peace sign, or other hand signals that might have significance. And then also the setting and object. So where is it and what is contained in it? So that's step 1. So you can use these strategies to find all of the elements in step 1. In step 2, you're going to analyze everything that you found. So this is really where you identify a story in all of these elements that you've identified. So ways you can do this is you can consider the intent of the creator. So is this a documentary photograph? Is it a photographer that took a picture of someone? Or is it a painting of a story? Is it a mythological creature? Really thinking about like, what is it you're looking at and perhaps why it was made based on your prior knowledge or what you can see in front of you. Then you can start determining the relationships between the visual elements that you've identified. So are figures talking to each other? What are the figures doing? What objects are they holding? Are some objects bigger than others? Are some figures or creatures or animals, what are they doing? What are the relationships between all these visual elements that you have identified? You can also examine meaningful clues. So if there are some symbols that you have found, or maybe there is, the biggest figure in the picture, like maybe that's a clue. So really sort of dissecting these things on a deeper level. And then determine the context and history. So maybe on the title of the image, that it was made 100 years ago, and you can start thinking about, well, what was going on 100 years ago? And really contextualize that image in history. So once you've done that and you've sort of figured out what the story is, or a story, Then you can go into the third step, which is drawing conclusions about what you found or what the story is. So combining all the findings that you've had and maybe coming up with a story to share, sharing that story with others, then listening to their interpretations, because when you start doing that, you may notice things you didn't notice before, or realize that your experience is different from someone else's, and that's why they're interpreting it different, and that could bring you to some different conclusions or bring up some different messages. And then connect to your own experience. So maybe what would your story be how would you change the story, or what would your message be from the story? And then compare it to other materials. So is there maybe a similar painting that maybe has a different meaning, or how can you compare one story to another story you've heard from a different perspective? So this will really allow you to think deeper about what it means to read the image and what the message is. So now that I've sort of gone over our diagram here, I'm going to now try this out with with a piece from our collection. So we're all together going to take about 30 seconds to look at this image of Irises by Vincent van Gogh. And we'll just sort of scan around, make sure you look. You can start maybe taking inventory if you want to of what you see. Give it a couple more seconds. All right. So we can keep looking at it, but I do want to call attention to, we just did the 30-second look, but you could also verbally describe it. If you're able to on your device, you can zoom in and out to look at different elements, or you could draw or write about it. So some of the visual elements that I saw when I was taking inventory during our 30-second look is I was thinking about the setting. This looks like it's perhaps a garden. Some of the things I see are what I would say, because of the title, are irises. I see some other flowers, maybe back behind. It looks like there's some white flowers in the back, very back far. There's this white flower in the foreground. On the left side, I don't see any symbols, but I do see Vincent written in the bottom corner, which might symbolize something. I don't know. I don't see some figures, but these flowers do seem like they're their own figures in a way. So I kind of thought about that, and then some formal elements. So I mentioned color a little bit ago. So there's a white flower, there's some blue flowers in the foreground, there's some orange, and there's green leaves that are really wavy, and they have wavy lines coming through. The white flower, I also noticed that the stem is really straight up and down compared to the wavy leaves of the flowers around it. And then also I thought about perspective. And if I were to have taken this, let's say if it is a photograph, or if I were, painting from observation, I would have to be really low down to the ground to be in the right position to view these flowers in their natural habitat. So those are all of the things I was thinking about when I was taking inventory. And then, so if we go to step 2 and we start thinking about the story or what the story might be, for me, a meaningful clue was this white flower in the front, or on the left side, sort of in the front. To me, it just seemed like it was separate from the rest because it's a different color. It's sort of positioned in a different way. It's higher up, or it seems to stand higher. I thought about the intent of the creator. So this painting was actually created in the final year of Van Gogh's life when he had checked himself into an asylum in France. And he did about a little over 150 paintings of irises from the garden at this asylum. And so for me, that sort of contextualized this story in that sort of mood of perhaps being lonely or isolated. And then that led me to thinking about the relationships between the white flower and maybe the white flowers in the background, and how it's sort of separated and isolated, and it's around all of these like really wavy irises, sort of, and it's sort of standing alone in this scene. And then I thought about the perspective and how it's very intimate, how I would have to be really close in to take a look at these flowers. And so for me, that's my interpretation of the story. It's actually expected and great that some of you may have had a different interpretation. So that's where the next step comes in. So I would, maybe to connect it to my own experience, I could think about like, have I ever seen a garden like this before? Do I have any memories of a garden? Have I ever, laid in a garden and looked at the flowers in this way? And do I have any memories? If not, do I know of any stories that have that theme? And then, I would love to share, now that I've shared that story, one way that I could continue this process is to, what other ideas are out there, and how did someone else's understanding differ from mine, and what are those stories and why? And then that would sort of give this painting a message that's, a little bit past the story that I might have seen. So that's an example of how you would use that infographic of the 3 steps of how to read an image to read a piece from our collection. So now I'm going to go through 3 different pieces from our collection and how to connect those with ELA standards. And then Rebecca is going to come back and she's going to share how to connect some other pieces from our collection and images to social studies curriculum. And the standards that we referenced to map back to are the California Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts and the History Social Science Framework for California Public Schools. We did that because we're in California, but we hope that if you're not from California, that you will find some overlap with your state standards and still find connections. So since we just spent all that time talking about irises, I figured let's connect it to curriculum. So I have outlined some activities that you can do in your classroom, and it relates to the Reading Literature Anchor Standard 7. Use illustrations to describe details in a story, including characters, setting, events, and plot. And this is geared towards kindergarten through 2nd grade. And I'm going to go through each of these steps, so we'll revisit this slide, but you can see there's sensory exploration, draw, dictate, or write a story, and then discuss and share your story. So for the sensory exploration, we took inventory. I won't go through all of it, but what you could do is have your students use sentence stems to verbally describe the image. So I see, I hear, I feel. And then you could do a graphic organizer together if you have littles, the little kiddos, or if your students can pair and share or work individually, you can if you have older students. And so this is a way to just make exhaustive lists of everything that you see in this painting. For the next step, to analyze and really figure out what the story is, or a story is, have students pick their favorite flower and write a story or draw a story or dictate a story about their favorite flower. And then for synthesize, you could have the student draw a new garden with the flower that they chose, and then share those drawings with the class and use sensory words and to describe their new garden to others. So that was for irises. So you could read that image with your K through second grade students. So we did sensory exploration, draw, dictate, or write a story, and then discuss or share your story. For the next one, I've chosen a drawing from our collection. It's called An Enchanted Cellar with Animals. And these activities are geared towards the 3rd through 5th grade students. And really it's still that anchor standard for reading literature, except this time we've included, you know, motivations, interaction, thoughts, and actions of all of the characters in a story. And so you'll see here, we've also come up with some activities you could do for each step of reading an image. So annotate, add thought or speech bubbles, and then write a narrative and share. So for annotate, you know, you could draw lines and label items in the image like objects, figures, and animals. This might look familiar as a picture word inductive model. So you could color code the different types of objects and just make an exhaustive line, you know, points, and separate them by objects, animals, and figures. And then, you know, maybe there's some discussions about I see this monkey in the front with the column. It's like, is he a person? Is it a monkey? Is it an animal? So you could just make an exhaustive list for the inventory part of reading this image. And then to figure out the motivations of all of the characters and maybe what they're doing and what they're thinking or saying, you can add speech bubbles to all of the animals and the person and really try to think about what they're saying. Are there any conflicts? Are there certain characters that are talking to each other? Like I see in this front here, the monkey again on the column, he's like talking to this owl in the front. Like I imagine that they're having a conversation. And then I'm also thinking about like, what is this person? Like, what is he thinking when he walks in? So then that would be a sort of writing element to this process. And then at the end, you could write a narrative about one of the characters in the scene, and then share those out with each other and then contrast stories, because maybe someone else interpreted this image completely different and they didn't think it was mischievous like I do. Like I'm looking at this monkey with the red jacket in the front, and he's sort of waving and he's got 2 rocks. And I'm thinking that he might be starting a fire or something like that, but maybe someone else thinks something different. So the 3 steps to that were annotate the image, add thought bubbles, and then write a narrative and share. All right, so the last one that I'm going to talk about before turning it over to Rebecca is this medieval manuscript of St. George and the Dragon. And this connects to, again, reading literature, how an illustration conveys a story and analyze the elements. And then we're also going to formulate an opinion about the story. So there's 3 activities for this one. The elaboration game, we're going to look at characters to decide the story and then compare and contrast the 2 stories. So for the elaboration game, you would break your students into groups of 3. And in round 1, each person would select a section of the artwork and describe what they see. And then you would, the next person would describe their section, and then the next person would describe their section. And then you would go through round 2, and each person would pick a different section and elaborate, because maybe the first person missed something. And you would just keep going until you think that you have this exhaustive list of everything. You haven't missed any part. And during this process, you would not give your opinions. You would just only describe what you see to each other. So in those same groups for step 2, trying to identify the story, you would zoom in on all of the characters and really look at their body language to determine the feelings and motivations of the characters. So for example, this woman in the bottom right, she's sort of curving her back and she's got her hands out. And I just imagine, like, the word that comes to mind for me is like forlorn, like she's sort of scared or or you know, like, oh, like she's about to faint maybe. And then I look at St. George, and he's like up high and powerful, and he has this sword. And then I look at the dragon, and the dragon sort of looks like he's being defeated, and the horse that St. Peter is riding is sort of overwhelming him. So you basically just go through the process of looking at the body language of the characters to determine what the story might be. And then you would, as a group, determine that story, and then you could share it to the rest of the group if you wanted to. And then for the next one, I really wanted to talk about comparing to other materials. So I've included another drawing. It's from Japan. And it is it comes from a similar story about a dragon, but this is an under the sea dragon. That it's a story about an under the sea dragon, and this octopus is one of his minions, I guess. And then this hero is fighting the octopus. And so one thing that strikes me when I'm comparing these two is that the body language of the woman who is very forlorn in the St. George image is very similar to the woman who is fighting the octopus in the other image. And so to me, that makes me really think about, well, like, why is that? Like, why am I interpreting this body language differently? And then you can start dissecting it that way. And then, you know, you can go through the whole process of, you know, taking inventory and analyzing of that second image, and then compare all of your notes with each other and with other people. All right, so I think I'm going to go to the last slide. So just to kind of button that last one all up. So we did the elaboration game. We look at characters to decide the story, and then we compare and contrast two stories for the last step. And now I am going to hand it over to Rebecca again. And she is going to share some ideas for connecting to social studies.
All right, thanks, Darcy. So Darcy went ahead and shared with you some thoughts about how we can connect these visual literacy exercises to ELA curricula. And I'd like to take some time now to do the same with the social science curriculum. Because there is less overlap between grades in the social science curriculum, although there's some, I've divided up activities in align different images with different grades. So to get us started, we're going to look at this image of a firefighter. It's a photograph, as I'm sure you could tell. And we're going to look at a kindergarten standard, which is understand how people lived in earlier times and how their lives would be different today. And we're also going to look at a first grade standard that's similar, which is students compare and contrast everyday life in different times and places, and recognize that some aspects of people, places, and things change over time while others stay the same. So we thought that this was a great image to connect with those standards. So here's a quick overview of what we'll be looking at in terms of the steps for look, see, observe, analyze, and synthesize. I'll come back to the slide. So first, let's get started with a warm-up of a 30-second look. So if you'd like to add a warm-up activity before you jump into the visual literacy, the how to read an image process, you can certainly do that. We've included warm-ups in some of our examples, but not in all of them. So similar to the 30-second look that Darcy did with Van Gogh's irises. Let's take a minute or 30 seconds to be exact and have you take a look, scan your eyes over this image and see what details you notice. Okay. So, and in the classroom, you may actually give closer to 30 seconds. I gave you more like 10 seconds. So once you've asked students to take 30 seconds or a minute to look at the photograph, you can use sentence stems to discuss key aspects of the image. So the sentence stems that work really well with this image are he's wearing, he's holding, and he looks like he's feeling. So for he's wearing, you might look at his jacket, which looks, and explore it a little bit. Notice that there are two tones to it. You might notice the very large line of buttons down the center. You might notice the collar. It looks somewhat formal, like a uniform. What else is he wearing? I'm sure students will notice the hat or the helmet very quickly, and may also notice that it has the number 3 on it. Similarly, there's that metal that's a little bit askew, which students may notice, as well as a belt buckle that reminds me at least of the belt buckles that are stereotypically pictured with the pilgrims at Thanksgiving, and certainly doesn't look like your average belt buckle today. When talking about what he's holding, certainly that musical instrument will come in mind. So it's a cornet. You may, with your students, need to have a discussion about, well, what could it be? It looks like a trumpet, or is it a bugle? And introduce them to a cornet as a type of wind instrument. You can also look at his facial expression. We love, especially with younger students, talking about facial expressions because it's a great way to develop empathy and start to understand others and how they're communicating to you about how they feel. So his face is an interesting one to look at in terms of what's going on with his mouth. Is that a smile? Is it a peaceful look? Does he look proud? So then what you can do with your students, and depending on their level, you can do it together on the board, or you can let them do it on their own if you think they're ready for it. You can, similar to Darcy's ELA activity, you can create an opportunity for them to annotate the image. This also is an opportunity to work on new vocabulary that can be used later on to talk about this image. Then for analyzing it, have your students put it all together. Take that inventory that they've done and discuss, who could this man be? What clues tell us that? And why do you think this portrait was made? We suspect, though we don't know, this was made by an unknown maker. We don't know who the photographer is who took this image. An educated guess might focus us in on that metal and make us think that perhaps this was celebrating somebody who was a hero as a fireman. Maybe he had done something special. And then put it all together. So for grades K and 1, talking about then and now fits very well with the standards. You can do a graphic organizer as a class with the teacher taking notes, following up on that initial discussion of what he's wearing, what he's holding, and how he might be feeling. And then compare those aspects of how he's pictured with the firefighters that students know today. Talk about, for example, the fact that even though his jacket looks very different from the ones that firefighters now wear to protect them from the heat of the fire, it still does look like a uniform of some sort. You could talk about whether that medal looks like medals that we see today, like an Olympic medal. You could talk about the shape of the fire hat or helmet. To me, it's interesting that the shape of the helmet is very similar to the shape of helmets today, even though it's not as high tech. Similarly, the idea of having the number on the front of the helmet representing which fire station this firefighter was attached to is not all that different from today. The cornet is also interesting to talk about. It was used by this firefighter as a way, it's an alarm. It's a way of alerting the town that there's a fire and firefighters are coming to fight that fire. So we have loud sounds that we use today, but they're sirens and they're a little bit different, but it's the same concept. So summarizing, with this image, you could annotate using start a discussion using sentence stems and then annotate using the words that you identified, figure out who's pictured, and then put it together, comparing then and now. So that's one example that fits with the social science curriculum. Here's another one. This image by Dorothea Lange is connected very deeply with the social science curricula. I've called out a couple of standards for 3rd and 4th grade and noted a few others for 4th grade as well. And you can probably find others. So for 3rd grade, discuss the importance of public virtue and the role of citizens, including how to participate in a classroom, in the community, and in civic life. And for 4th grade, describe rapid American immigration, internal migration, settlement, and the growth of towns and cities. So this, for your reference, is a photograph of students in a classroom in San Francisco in 1942. So here's an overview. I'm going to jump ahead and walk us through the steps. So this, with this image, it seemed like a good fit to take a journalistic point of view when your students are looking at it and getting started taking inventory. So you could invite them to imagine that they're a journalist and imagine that they're arriving on the scene and look closely and see what the clues are. You can use who, what, where, when. We'll save why for the next step. So who's pictured? What are they doing? Where might they be? About when was the photograph taken? So in terms of who's pictured, they could guess about the ages of these kids. They could notice the diversity of faces within this group. What are they doing? So many of them have their hands on their heart. So you could talk about what that might be. They're saying the Pledge of Allegiance. It's also interesting to note that many of them are looking up. So what might they be looking up at? Where might they be? So what would be a setting in which lots of kids are together saying the Pledge of Allegiance? Students could think about that and put those ideas together. And for thinking about when, they could look at their clothing to get an idea, see if they have an idea of whether this is recent or a little while ago. Another thing that students might use as a clue is the fact that it's a black and white image. Okay, usually, although color photography was later available, often even contemporary black and white photographs, we find that students instantly think that they're old, even when they're not. So then the next step in analyzing this would be to put it all together. So following along with our journalistic approach, to put it all together, go ahead and have your students write a headline. So imagine, what did the photographer want us to see here? What did he want to show us, or she, in fact, because this is a photograph by Dorothea Lange. So why did she make this? What was she trying to tell us? And if you found this photograph in a newspaper along with the story, what would that story say? Write the headline for what that story might be. And then finally, synthesizing, connect it to the historical context. And there's a lot of different routes that you could take with this, depending on what you've chosen to focus on in your class. Because it's 1942, this is a photograph that's subsequent to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It was taken after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but it's before the Japanese were sent away to internment camps. And in fact, the girl who's pictured in the front of the photograph, towards the viewer, did end up in Manzanar. You can also talk about the history of immigration in California leading up to 1942, and who might have been living in cities like San Francisco. And then you can, and there's more as well. Additionally, you can talk about the photographer Dorothea Lange, who's also mentioned in the 4th grade social studies standards, who was well known for having documented this time in American history. So then the last step, connecting this to the broader knowledge that students may have and that you may have covered in your classroom, would be to write yet another headline, not related to this image, but related to something else that was happening at that time that you may have studied. So placing this image adjacent to other things that students have learned about. If they're really into it and you want to take it to the next step, you could also write headlines for events leading up to this time, and for even for what might have happened next. So overviewing, first you be a journalist and take inventory of the image using who, what, where, when. Then write a headline after having considered, why was this made? What is it about? Finally, connect it with the historical context that you might have been covering in your class. So we have one last example for social science. So this covers the 5th grade standard that says, discuss the experience of settlers on the overland trails to the west, e.g. location of the routes, purpose of the journeys, the influence of the terrain, rivers, vegetation, and climate, and there's more in there. Now, for a warm-up for this image, I'm sure you're having trouble seeing it because I've condensed it onto this slide. If you go onto the Getty website, and I'm going to quickly switch over there, you can find the images on our website and use a tool to zoom. And when you zoom in, you can get a much better look. So I'm modeling that for you here. Certainly you wouldn't do it so quickly as I'm doing it right now, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how this is an occasion where using a zoom feature to really navigate through the image and see what the details are helps you really get deep into what it might be about. So going back to our slides. So there's our warm-up. Then take inventory. So for this one, and we have 5th grade students, so they can do more of the writing on their own. A graphic organizer is a great way to figure out all the details that are here that might be clues for what this stereograph is about. So here's a sample. I chose, you can choose what elements you'd like your students to focus on in terms of looking for details. I chose ones that I thought best lent themselves to the image and what I was hoping for them to take away from the experience of looking at it. So objects, which would be things like the wagons, it might be things like the, let's see, these kind of supports along the side of the road. It might be the rocky cliffs, might be the rubble that seems to be dropping down from the cliffs. The figures, so that takes some zooming in to see if there are any people or animals. The setting, perspective, considering where the camera was, what kind of movement is happening, thinking about the speed of the movement too, the composition of the image, and in this case, also noticing that there's 2, which might yield a conversation about what a stereograph is. And noticing also that there's some text, and the text tells us a little bit about this image because it says American scenery, views in Colorado. And depending on your students, it might be tricky for them to read this type. So there might also be a conversation about typefaces in different times. So then analyzing it, the next step would be to take all of those words that you've inventoried and to imagine what it would be like to travel with this wagon train on the westward journey. So the assignment for students would be to write a narrative about a day in the life of the settlers on the wagon train. And importantly, to build on the visual inventory at the beginning, make sure your students use details and vocabulary that they found and build that into their narrative. Lastly, you pair up students to share their narratives with each other and culminate in a discussion about how did the route and terrain affect the experience of settlers traveling west in the 1800s. So this image really captures that for us. It's like this for us is a picture's worth 1,000 words in terms of the story it tells about that time. So just in summary, do a visual inventory of details, write about a day in the life, and then share stories and discuss the big idea of how the terrain affected the settlers. Okay, so with that, we've mostly covered what we'd like to cover in terms of visual literacy. There are a couple of questions that give us an opportunity to build out a couple of the ideas. So what I'd like to do is invite Darcy back to the screen and go through some of the great questions that you have posed to us. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. So one of the questions that I really love and would like to take some time to talk about is, and I'll read it to you, do we need to know an artist's bio and life when he painted a painting to enjoy and understand the art piece better? Can we just enjoy the colors, the style, and so on? And this is the perfect question for this webinar. Would you like to take a stab at answering it, Darcy? And then if there's anything else to add, I'll chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I was looking, while I was talking about, discovering the story in step 2, I don't know if any of you noticed, but I kept saying discover a story. And really, you don't have to know anything about the artist to enjoy or appreciate a work of art, or to interpret it, or to take the elements of a work of art and add meaning to them. And also when you start sharing your interpretations with other people, you'll notice there are other perspectives that maybe you didn't notice. And I think that that's what makes it so beautiful. And so, no, I would say you don't need to know anything to enjoy it and to interpret it. So that's my answer, but I bet Rebecca has more to add.
Well, when you're doing visual literacy exercises, above all, it's great to start with the looking and the analysis and the inventory and the pulling it all together, the synthesis, because it's really about building those skills of understanding what an image is telling you. So if you start out by reading a description of the image, that kind of undermines the process of building those critical thinking skills with images. So with this kind of exercise, it's certainly not the place that I would start. What we find in our teaching in the galleries at the Getty and when working with K-12 students with images is that the process of exploring an image and wondering about it and trying to figure out what the artist or the maker was trying to tell us inspires students to want to know more. So it's really helpful for the teacher to go to our webpage or for whatever image you're using to have some information in your back pocket so that when those questions come up, the best example from the works of art that I selected is the fireman, where I had to look up that that's a coronet because I don't know off the top of my head what a coronet looks like. So it's useful to have that information as the discussion evolves. But our approach is really to not front load the conversation with information, but to sprinkle it in as questions come up about what you might be looking at. And the other thing about art is while there is the artist intention, and it's helpful to know what the artist intention is, art goes out into the world just like any other text, and it becomes something else based on how the viewers see it. And that applies to social media now as well, right? And images that are, on TV and that are just filling our worlds. So it's not just about its intent. It's really important to also be able to think about what it means just as the image stands alone. Okay, so there's another question about, so this is a practical question. Which is there a way to get images to show in our class? I know I can look up images, but do you have a resource we can use that includes images? I teach dual language kinder, and this webinar will be very helpful for my ELD students and my EOs as well. Thank you. Well, and so for the Getty Museum, we have a very encyclopedic collection database. And I showed you an example when I pulled up that image of the wagon train that I was zooming in on. That was from our database. And you can download those images for free, most of them, not all of them, to your computer and put them in slides or use them yourself, however you like to. But we also often just you'll notice I didn't download it. I accessed it directly from the website while I was talking with you, because the resolution is so great that the power of zooming and the level of detail that you can see is really wonderful. You can also download very high resolution images. They're just large files. So the Getty is the challenge with the Getty's website is that we have so many works of art that you can take some time searching if you're looking for an image of, I mean, there are not a lot of images of firefighters, but if you were to put in a word like frog, you might find a lot of images of frogs, a lot to look through. So there's really a lot to find if you play around with the search tool on the website. And we'll share some links to that in the resource folder. Additionally, we will share with you the images that are used in this slide deck. And then other museums also have different not all museums have the same level of collections databases, but a lot of them do. The image that Darcy used, that was a Japanese woodblock print with the octopus in it, that came from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which also has a very encyclopedic online collections database for art. So if you look around, you can find a lot of places where you can get images for free at very high resolution. Let's see. So we will answer one last question kind of quickly. Can you talk about using photographs versus paintings or sculptures, and how to overcome the assumption that photographs are real and paintings are made up?
I feel like this question is sort of a good one to lead into the rest of our series because we are going to be going deeper into like researching and looking at the background of an image more deeply through conversation or research. But I do think that it's through that conversation at the end, through the synthesizing, that you decide what truth is or what real is, or decipher that. I mean, it can go really subjective, like with the Van Gogh painting, you know, it's like, was that white flower really by itself? And Van Gogh found it that way and painted it that way? Or did Van Gogh make the choice to put the white flower alone? And was that intentional? So I think sometimes you may not know like the answer to that, but having the conversation, I think, is part of it.
Well, and I think, you know, with the way that images are used now contemporarily in kind of media, and the ability to Photoshop images, this notion of what is real, representing the real, I think is a really important topic for students to be addressing, because even photographs are no longer, you know, are never
even
real.
Video.
In fact, yeah, none of it is real necessarily, right? And that's a kind of a tricky assumption where we think of photographs as representing the real, but in fact, that's very deceptive. And so these conversations that come from visual literacy exercises really naturally lead into this kind of a question. And yes, as Darcy said, we'll be covering the topic of dialoguing about topics of visual literacy and critically analyzing images in one of our subsequent webinars. And so that webinar will also start to cover some of these more in-depth questions about what discussions look like. Okay, so we're running out of time. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the Q&A. Thank you, Darcy, so much. Thank you again for attending. We hope to see you again at a future Getty webinar. Have a great evening.